We got a big crowd today here for the food fish culture session, and we're going to start off with Natalie. Natalie's going to give you a brief introduction, starting from a global perspective about culturing food and bringing it all the way down to Florida. And we want to thank the Department of Ag and Consumer Services because we are using their PowerPoint presentation to introduce food fish culture. And then we have Lauren Davis, and she is going to talk to us about her family farm, the Evans Farm, where they culture sturgeon and tilapia, and she'll join us live in a little bit. So let's start with Natalie.
So hi everyone, today we're going to be talking about food fish culture. So again, this PowerPoint has actually been modified from the Division of Aquaculture. It came out in 2017. And like Leslie said, we will be talking about a global fish perspective, but then coming more home to what's going on here in Florida's industry. So where do our fish come from? I'm going to ask you guys that. Since most of you are fishermen, where do you think all our fish comes from? Ocean, farms. Right. So exactly. So that's the idea. You guys have a little bit more of a unique situation that most of you live on the coast, so you get to see firsthand where our fish comes from. When it comes from wild capture, it comes from things like oceans, lakes, and rivers. But we also have aquaculture farms like ponds, tanks, and pens. So you guys, being near Cedar Key, get to see a little bit of both of that, where we do recirculating systems, we do grow out cultures for clams and oysters, but then you also see the fisheries aspect as well. When you live a little bit more inland, you might not see that situation. So you might see what we had prior, which is just the grocery store, where you go up and you go into the frozen food section and you pick out your fish. Or you might go to the counter and pick up what you think is a fresh slice of salmon kind of thing, not coming directly from the wild, but coming from the store itself. So a brief history of food fish. 1 billion people actually depend on fish as their primary source of protein. So they don't really have access to things like beef, chicken, and pork. They get their protein source from seafood itself. But something to remember is that the world's population is increasing. So as it increases, that means there's more of a demand for food fish. So what does this mean for fisheries? They say that 90% of wild fisheries are at a maximum harvest. So that means that a lot of fish are being fished at their maximum or are being over harvested. They say that 90 million tons of fish per year are coming in. So that's the maximum sustained yield, which means that that's basically how much fish you can take out while that population is still being sustained for the years to come. That being said, aquaculture is rapidly growing, and this is to meet either supply shortages, whether they're coming from wild fisheries, or just to introduce new ways of getting our fish to different countries. So aquaculture is an efficient form of animal agriculture, as I'm sure you guys know.
So specify exactly what that's saying, the yellow bracket.
Oh, so the yellow bracket there, that's showing where those 90% of wild fisheries are at the maximum. If you're below that bottom yellow bracket, it's saying it's underfished. So that's fisheries where we're actually not collecting as many fish as we could be. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what does that mean for capture fisheries and in aquaculture? Well, in 1950s, 97% of our fish were actually caught from the ocean. Only 3% were actually done via aquaculture. If you start to look at the graph, though, you can see that wild fisheries increased up until around the 1990s. Since then, it's actually started to plateau, and it hasn't really increased for the past 30 years. Today, if you look, about 53% of our food fish come from the ocean. 47% actually is aquacultured, and a majority of that fish comes from Asia.
So let's think about this from a Florida perspective, which you're familiar with. If you look at the year, well, you can't see the date on there, 2018, but reptiles. And here in Florida, the fishing of different food fish was greatly restricted. So that's why you got that plateau. Not only just the fact that maybe the fish stocks aren't able to support the increased harvesting, but also in countries like US, we're having increased regulations that are limiting the harvesting of wild fish. You could. The problem always comes into play is the economics behind it. Okay, so how much does it cost to raise that fish, and how much can you sell it for, and can you make money? At least in the United States, that's the big limitation for food fish production. It's okay if we don't capture it all, as long as we just get some exchange.
So what they actually are saying is that aquaculture will soon be the norm. They actually project in 2025 about 52% of our food fish will come from aquaculture. And in 2013, I found this really interesting. There was more fish farmed globally than there was beef each year. So yeah,
I don't know if I can believe that.
I thought that was really, really interesting to think about.
Isn't there more diseases in beef than there is in fish?
Well,
Yeah,
in
like
terms,
mad
so
cow.
again, but again, if we look at the history of, particularly in developed countries, of farming beef versus fish,
Beef
many more, years of research looking at beef production than farm fish
especially
production.
like Texas or
Yeah. But that is hard to see, but you have to remember, we are now looking at this
From a global
worldwide
perspective.
And the US is just a little blip in this perspective. Well, there you go.
So where does our fish come from? About 22% of our fish is actually produced here in the US. But what does that mean about all our other fish? Nearly 80% of it's actually imported. And most of it actually comes from Asia, about 50% from Asia. And what I thought was really interesting is that this has resulted in a $14 billion deficit. And if you think about it, it's because we're importing a lot more fish product than we're actually producing. But when you think about it, aquaculture is becoming more prevalent, right? They're saying it will become the norm. So we'll see how that kind of balances out later on in the future.
Before you move, so that is really important. In terms of seafood, that's our second biggest trade deficit. Look at what is first. Obviously, you should know that, oil. But after oil, seafood. That's really amazing.
Asia has like a big fish culture there too, so
Oh, yeah.
they're probably way ahead of the game.
Well, remember in a previous presentation, we looked at kind of who was the big producer of aquaculture overall. It was China. So it's not surprising to see all of Asia contributing over 50% of where the fish is coming from.
China does a lot.
Yeah.
But it has a big population.
So knowing where a lot of our fish is being produced, I want to kind of ask you guys, what do you think the top fish species that are being cultured are? Tilapia?
You're never
Sturgeon.
going to guess this.
You're never going to, yeah.
Goldfish.
Well, that's close.
That's very close.
That's close. But do you like to eat goldfish?
Food fish.
Food fish.
But you're close.
I
Mhm.
can eat goldfish.
Well,
I'll do it right now.
I'd eat a
I can't
goldfish.
anything. That's not fair. No.
So that actually brings us to the top 10 food fish. And if you look, 6 of the top 10 are carp.
Well, goldfish is in the
Clams?
Yeah, manila clam, yeah.
Again, Asian.
So most of these foods, right, so a lot of our fish that's being cultured is happening in Asian cultures. And if you look at what kind of fish they are, a lot of it's carp, and that's a lot of the fish that's used in their cuisines. So they eat a lot of carp. So that makes sense as to why it's.
Never had grass carp.
We used to raise carp.
Did you?
We used to raise grass carp in Binghamton.
Oh, well,
Oh yeah, I grew up.
you grew up in yeah.
Oh,
There's
wow.
a lot of carp production. Of course, grass carp is used primarily, although I was really surprised to see it being the big food fish.
Cool.
But in the U.S., it's used for it's a herbivore.
Yeah, that's what we
Mhm.
used
So it's
it
used
for.
in helping, we just learned about aquatic plant weeds.
Yeah.
It's used to help keep.
So they use the carp to
Grass
bring down
carp.
those.
Yeah, we
Plant
use for
populations.
putting in ponds to decrease plant growth, and then the big head carp we used to raise and sell.
Hmm.
So obviously carp is a fairly easy fish to raise. I mean, and actually they've been raising it since 500 BC. Just in very simple ponds. It was raised in the Roman Empire. You used to have evidence of fish culture then, and it was carp. So carp's not only a very valued food fish for protein for Asia and even Europe, but also it's used a lot in fish meals, actually being fed to other fish of more higher value, actually also used in different fertilizers and stuff. So,
Fish fertilizer.
yeah.
Carp is gross. Never had carp. It's nasty.
Well,
I don't like tilapia.
somebody must like it.
I don't like tilapia though, so I think tilapia.
Maybe it's the way it's cooked.
Yeah, I like,
My dad did.
Have my dad cook it.
as long as you purge tilapia before you plant it.
Yes.
So that being said, the top 6 food fish aquaculture countries are China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and Norway.
Where's the U.S.?
Yeah, where is the US, guys? No, China's number 1 and then it's India. The US isn't even in the top 6. That being said, China produces 62% of the world's food fish. 60% is the inland food fish, 94% is crustaceans, and 83% is mollusks, and that's just China. Going to shrimp, USA is number 3, and in another slide that's been updated from this, we're actually number 2.
That's surprising.
It is surprising, isn't it? Yeah.
You could grow clams in like a big recirculating system.
You could, you just couldn't make money.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
So now we're going to bring it to the US. You can see from 1998 to 2013, our aquaculture food fish industry has actually increased. So food fish is that dark blue on the bottom there. And in 1998, it was about 71% of the total industry. In 2013, it actually only makes up about 53% of the industry, but that's because we're factoring things like ornamental fish and mollusk culture and crustaceans. So those aquaculture sectors have kind of grown as well.
It kind of looks like sport fish, bait fish, ornamental fish are all kind of the same.
Yeah,
They've changed too much.
from there to there, but it's the mollusk that has really changed.
Yeah, look
Yeah.
at that. And that's in part because of where? Cedar Key.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So before we get there, what states do you think are the big producers then of food fish?
A food fish.
A food fish.
California, would they be one?
California.
So we used to raise fish in Missouri.
I know they do.
Missouri.
I know they do food salmon in California.
Arkansas does salmon.
Texas. Wow, I didn't-
Right.
I didn't think Texas would be
So here we have it. Mississippi comes in at number 1. Then we have Alabama, Washington, Texas, Idaho, California, Arkansas.
Oh, you're good, dude.
Yeah.
And the good there, Trey, you're up there. Okay, but before we move on, what would Mississippi be produced? Now, think about Mississippi, big state of Mississippi, little coastline. What would they be producing food fish wise to make them number 1 in the US? Think about that.
Catfish.
Think about Alabama. What do you think about Alabama?
short catfish.
Yeah. Washington State.
Salmon.
Mhm.
Yeah. Whoever said salmon in Arkansas.
What would be in Texas though? I know they have gigantic redfish.
So they have
Oh, I
redfish
do-
farms,
yeah.
they have
Huge
hybrid striped
rays.
bass. I don't know what else.
My favorite thing to do at a restaurant is when they have redfish on the menu. Ask
Yeah.
me if it's locally caught, and I said, yeah. No redfish.
But
It's
you
locally
know,
caught. It's
I
all
know.
from Texas.
Yeah,
Hmm.
Texas. I came here from Texas to raise redfish. I raised them in Texas.
It's interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, people will go fishing and they have big anchor rigs, is what they call them, like bull redfish, and you catch like 30-inch redfish.
There's massive reds.
So where's Florida on here?
Yeah, where's Florida?
Oh, there.
Way behind. Why don't
We're
we
in the
say
other.
We're in the other.
5% of the U.S. food fish is produced here in Florida. So what's the #1 food fish produced in the U.S.? It's the channel catfish. So a little bit about the channel catfish. You have Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama producing it. And so why do you think Mississippi is producing the highest quantity of catfish? Yes, so it has the Mississippi Delta and it has the Black Prairie. So it's aligned with those areas that are very optimal for growing catfish.
So what you had is very large agriculture farms along the Mississippi Delta, rich fertile land where they were growing different ag crops. And they began diversifying maybe 40 or so years ago and added ponds for catfish production. Very big production, but you're going to find out what has happened to that production in recent years.
More barbs.
More barbs.
More barbs.
Yeah, well, that's true.
So other species that are produced by the U.S. are crawfish, trout, salmon, and tilapia. But as you can see, from 2008 to 2012, the overall food fish production in the U.S. has decreased. So do we have any guesses as to why?
Yeah, so look at the blue bars. That's the ones that are dramatically decreasing.
Regulation or environmental issues.
Well, actually, those two generally tend to be a problem, but that's not the overarching problem as to why catfish, a big industry.
Yeah.
Think more outside the world. Think globally now.
More other people are producing it.
Yes.
Other people are producing it, so that means competition.
So we kill all their fish. Don't want our fish.
And then they send us fish cheaper. Catfish. It's called Vasa. Vasa, grown in Vietnam and Asia, come in and it's cheaper, and your various Cisco and food distributors freeze it and it tastes just as good. So let's serve it in the restaurant.
Where do they farm crawfish at?
Louisiana.
I thought all crawfish were caught out of coolers after rain.
In Missouri, we would certain ponds we put a higher standpipe where grass would grow in it. And you let it sit for like a year or two. And you pull the drain pipe and the mud literally just crawl. There's massive. No, what we do is we bring the coolers and pull the plugs out. You take a shovel and just shovel the mud into the cooler and you drag it out and just rinse with a hose and the cooler all crawl.
Wow.
So in Louisiana, they intentionally do it that way, and they plant rice.
Well, we would every once in a while.
Right.
And we would have a big crop.
Well, then they'll harvest the rice, and then the crawfish will eat kind of the rest of the plant. It's kind of an it's like polyculture. You're doing two different things, but you get two crops.
So how are these species produced? Catfish and crawfish are done in ponds, trout in raceways, salmon sea pens, and then we have tilapia in tanks.
We did
Ponds and raceways. So why do you think it might be different, or why would you might want to use different methods for grow out?
Depending on where you're at.
Depending on where you're at. We'll talk about it a little bit more. Yeah, so it depends on how big your farm is. How much money and capital are you investing into this? There's also different methods that can be used to grow these kinds of fish. So it's not one method fits just this species. You can use different ones, and it varies depending on where you are. And
it varies upon the species. So trout, typically, are you going to grow a trout in Florida? No. So trout are more cold water. So actually in the mountains of North Carolina where you have trout, we have a lot of available, excessive, cold water through springs and so forth. That's why they're able to use raceways, because they have a lot of access of the right kind of water to raise the trout.
When I went to California, I did a charter and I caught a salmon. And when you catch it, the captain will tell you there's a fin on there that I guess whenever they breed them in captivity, they cut the fin off.
So you know it's a hatchery.
Yeah, so and the one I caught was a hatchery fish.
Why was that even piping?
so here in Florida, we actually grow tilapia, catfish, pompano, cobia. hybrid striped bass, and sturgeon. And today you'll actually get to talk to Lauren Davis, again from Evan Farms, about tilapia and sturgeon farming. So Florida food fish industry. In 2005, there were 49 farms here in Florida. If you look at 2013, there was a sales value of $19.9 million, but this value includes shrimp. And again, shrimp are not fish technically. So if we exclude them from that number, the food fish industry brought in $3.6 million. Again, to think about it, shrimp is huge. It takes up about 74% of the top food fish sales here in Florida, and we are second in nation in shrimp production sales. I don't want to focus too much on shrimp, but we will talk about it a little bit later. In 2005, there were 7 farms, and we have increased in shrimp farms to 20 in 2013. So there is an increase in that. So different culture methods used here in Florida. For pond species, you might see catfish, tilapia, and shrimp. In recirculating tanks, you might see hybrid striped bass, tilapia, shrimp, and sturgeon. And if you see, tilapia and shrimp can be grown in both ponds and recirculating tanks. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, where it's determined by the size of the farm, how much money do they want to invest, where are they located. So it kind of depends on what the farmers they want to do. So for the pond culture methods, we're going to talk about catfish culture. So again, ponds vary in size. Typically, broodstock and larvae ponds are a lot smaller than the grow-out ponds. And if you look at the top photo, that's an aerial view of a catfish culture farm. And so you can see that a lot of these ponds are about 10 acres in size each. So that's very, very large. What's really interesting is how they feed. So they use an air power spreader. Have you seen this?
Oh,
yeah.
This looks so familiar.
Do you want to describe it to the group?
It's like a huge t-shirt cannon. That's
Yeah.
kind of what it is. And it just shoots feed out into the pond. And then the catfish goes nuts.
Exactly.
Yeah, look at 'em.
How
Yeah.
did you get the catfish out of the pond?
Where'd you just stand there?
You're gonna see that in a
Sorry,
minute.
sorry.
Yeah.
They have huge sand nets. What it is, you have two huge schools, or one huge school.
You're skipping. You're going way too quickly.
That's okay.
I want to show them the photos. Ready?
Oh,
We'll go right
you
there.
go.
Yeah,
So you can see them.
Well, ours was bigger than that. It was like twice that.
Yeah.
It was this huge school that was saying that like every 2 weeks or so you'd have to run it across the whole length of the driveway and everyone would have to patch it. But you literally a truck or normally a tractor pulled it, and the levees are literally as big as your tires are. Like one mistake and you're in the pond. And so they pull the tractor up and you run the seine net all the way across the pond. You have your lead line and your float line, and you literally have to stand on the lead line and push the float line up. Like carp and stuff, they'll ram the net, so you'll get hit. Like my uncle's got his teeth knocked out by a grass
Oh,
carp.
wow.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, they jump.
Oh
That's how
yeah.
that happened.
But you
Is that
literally,
the ones that jump out the water?
They carp to grass carp will jump.
but
Yeah.
you have to stand on the lead line so they can't go under that. You have to lift float line so they can't go over. And
Walk with it.
Yeah, so you can see in the photo there that the float line's on the top of the pond and the lead line's all the way down at the bottom. And usually you'd have people again walking on, so you can see the guy in the pond right there walking along with it.
And then you get it to the corner like that. And like we normally just had buckets and nets. We pull it up to the corner and you just net stuff in the buckets. And if you had like big head carp, you'd have to like pick them up by hand and carry them. I got several shiners as a little kid picking up grass carp running up the bank. They just hit you in the eye and they fall back in the water.
Here they actually use cranes. So you can see depending, I mean, these are like 10-acre ponds, so you can use a crane to scoop all those fish out. They may even segregate different sections depending.
Like lost turtles. Very big turtles.
Yeah. So for catfish culture,
We did that.
you did this?
Yep.
Okay, so you can take different containers and you typically puncture them and you create a spot in the water where you sink this container down where the females can go and spawn or lay their eggs. The farmer then actually collects those egg masses. So you can see that in the middle photo, him collecting those egg masses from the containers. And then they go into troughs that have paddles, and this mimics male parental care. And so catfish lay adhesive egg masses. So all the eggs are kind of stuck together. So if you think about what happens in nature, typically a female will go for a woody area that has some type of cavity so that the eggs are well protected. She'll lay those eggs and the eggs actually stick to that cavity. So this is kind of what we're mimicking in the ponds, where we're putting those containers down, trying to mimic that cavity for her to lay her eggs. Once the eggs are laid, the male will then come and guard them. And he actually uses the back of his tail and he fans them. And so that allows the eggs to stay oxygenated. It allows water flow. And then it allows for any like debris to be kind of removed off of them. And so in aquaculture, the way they mimic that is in the troughs, those paddles, the paddles turn and they kind of mimic what the male's fanning of the tail would be. So that's what that looks like. Yeah, it's a lot. And they all stick together.
But look how big the eggs are too.
Yeah,
They're real. So it's a freshwater fish. They typically have big eggs. That means they have big yolks. That means they can survive a lot longer.
But,
Yeah.
did you eat that?
Do you eat, baby?
Did you eat like
sturgeon?
Yeah, I mean, you can eat like sturgeon.
Oh no, that typically is not considered.
You don't eat-
No,
you don't eat
no.
those, catfish fries?
I think they're too valuable as
Yeah.
fry and then fingerlings.
So again, going back to the big size of the egg, it uses that egg yolk sac for energy. So it's going to absorb all those nutrients and they'll continue that until the yolk sac is completely absorbed in the indoor hatchery. Then they're moved to grow out ponds. So you can see these are the catfish fry. And then when they're in the ponds, they're raised there for about 15, 18 months until they're ready to be harvested. In the seine nets, like you were saying earlier, how they drop the seines in with the lead weights, the floats are on top. They pull that across the whole entire pond, get them cornered or put in one specific area. And here you can see a crane being used to pull up the fish.
So we have marine species of catfish. They're not the ones we typically raise and harvest and eat. But the fry in these ponds, so when you stock the ponds and you walk around, these little fry are following you all around like you're the mama fish. It's really funny because that was how I made my money when I went to Auburn, is I worked on Auburn University's catfish ponds. So I don't know if you've noticed when you're in your clam lease and you're at
Catfish follow you around.
yeah, the little baby catfish follow you around. It's the same thing. Have you ever noticed that walking
Yeah,
around
just
at
stuck.
certain times of the year?
Or when you start shaking up.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, everywhere.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking about the little baby
Oh, yeah.
fry that you see. Yeah.
You shake out one bag.
Yeah.
I was fishing one time. I threw out a line and I thought I felt like something was on there. I reeled it in, and a baby catfish, probably like that big, was stuck by the gill.
Yeah.
And it just like swam by and hit the hook. And just,
Out on the pier, we were chasing that big one.
Oh, wow.
What kind of hooks were you using?
No, they were the one with the shrimp. They wouldn't.
Okay.
It's really fun.
Lastly, just a real quick tidbit about marine shrimp breeding. Florida is producing shrimp. Like we said earlier, it's #2 in the nation for producing shrimp. And we do have a facility in Southwest Florida that provides post-larval shrimp to farms all over the world. And we're not going to focus too much on that because, again, this is a food fish presentation, but just so you guys are aware of that.
So the shrimp that they raised, is it normally for food or is it normally for like bait?
No, so this particular breeding facility here is used
For stocking shrimp ponds, again, all over the world, for food.
So today we've covered a lot of ground. We went from a global perspective of fish produced all over the world to what's being produced right here at home in Florida. Again, this presentation came from the Division of Aquaculture, and we have a couple of different handouts that we have for you guys. So you'll see some on channeled catfish, which is again the #1 fish produced. You'll see one on tilapia and then on sturgeon. And then we'll have the opportunity to talk to Lauren Davis from Evan Fish Farms about some of the sturgeon and tilapia culture. Hold on, Lauren, I'm gonna unmute you now.
There she is.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
We see you and your dog.
Yes, that was my Auburn graduation picture.
So what
Okay.
did your dog major in?
My dog didn't major in nothing, sleeping.
Oh, there she is.
There we go.
Hi.
Okay, you guys, my Wi-Fi has kind of been in and out, so let me know if you guys have problems and I'll do a hotspot.
Okay.
Okay? All right.
So can you just start off and give us a little bit of your background and your family's farm?
Of course. So, well, I'm Lauren Davis. So I am the granddaughter of Marilyn Evans, and she owns the fish farm itself. So we are family owned and operated, and we have been for a really long time, since like 98 or so, since we've been selling our sturgeon and tilapia and stuff. So we are located in Pearson, Florida, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's actually the fern capital of the world, which is pretty funny. But when I was a kid, you know, my grandpa was always trying to keep my mom around, and he did this by creating the fish farm because she always loved fish. She works at Disney. I ended up going to University of South Florida, and I majored in marine biology. And then after that, I went to Auburn University to get my master's, and I did fisheries, aquaculture, and aquatic sciences. So you guys' presentation on catfish is very familiar to me because I work with catfish a lot. So we can go ahead and start this video. So we're on a 100-acre fish farm, like I said, in Pearson, Florida. So on our farm, we raise tilapias, 4 species of sturgeon, and actually recently we've acquired hybrid striped bass. So on your left-hand side, this is our processing building where we deal with processing caviar. And we're gonna walk out and see some fiberglass tanks. And the green building is our hatchery, where we will be talking about spawning the fish. Here are some of our ponds that we have where our tilapia are at. And then on your right-hand side, that's actually some concrete tanks where we have sturgeon. So just to give you an idea of what we have, sorry you guys couldn't physically be there to see what it is because it's really pretty. So like you guys can see, our tanks, our system is composed of tanks, ponds, and the hatchery. We actually have a completely recirculating system. So our water is flowing through our ponds, and it goes actually back into a detention pond where it is recycled back to our tanks. So we're recirculating that water and trying to create a sustainable water use for all of our fish. We also have multiple air compressors on our farm, which provides oxygen to our system. So oxygen and water are 2 of the most important things when it comes to fish farming for us. Obviously, since we're doing food fish and caviar fish, we want to make sure that our fish are as healthy as possible. So we need to keep them healthy and happy by having high oxygens and very clean water. So if you want to go ahead and we'll start talking about sturgeon. We do have 4 species. So we'll show you guys the second video, which is actually a beluga sturgeon. So these beluga sturgeon are from, these ones are actually from Russia. So we started our operation by importing eggs over from overseas and raising those to be adults. So these are actually from 2011, so they're 7 years old. Some of these fish are 100 pounds and they're not even mature yet, which is crazy. So there's definitely variation in the 4 species that we have. I was gonna show you guys videos of all of them, but we do have 4, so it would kind of take up time. But these species, as you guys were talking earlier about overfishing and things like that previously, Russian sturgeon are very, you know, in an evolution sense, they're very old when it comes to when they appeared on Earth. So they're similar to sharks where they mature and reproduce really slowly. So that makes them vulnerable to overfishing, which they have been in Russia, and actually for their caviar, especially this species beluga, which is now an endangered species. So I think you guys were talking a little bit about, like, because of all those things that are happening overseas impacting our farms here. So because these fish are listed as an endangered species now, we have problems selling them here in the United States. So we've been working with the government and trying to figure out, since these are farm raised, that's a really close picture. So we're trying to figure out if we're able to sell these guys and sell their caviar when they are mature. But for right now, we can only sell them within the state of Florida. And if you guys have questions or anything, feel free to stop me, or if you guys want to wait until the end, whatever's easier.
Well, let's find out. Do you have any questions so far about the farm pictures you saw, about these crazy looking fish? Those barbels on the bottom for that fish.
How
What-
much did you get paid for the caviar?
Oh, we already got the question about cost already. So how much do you get paid for the caviar? Wouldn't you know that'd be your first question?
It is. So it's actually dependent on the species. So right now we are only allowed to sell our Osetra, Siberian, and Sevruga. So our Osetra costs a little bit more than the other species just because it's more highly prized, and it actually has color variation. So some of the eggs can be gold, some of the eggs are black. So we're able to kind of sell that as well. So I'll give you an example. I just sold some Siberian caviar, 125 grams for $312. So it's going to be dependent on the species that we have, but we're talking hundreds of dollars for some grams of the eggs, which are pretty tiny to put
So
in.
125 grams is roughly about a third of a pound. For a third of a pound, you got over $300. But how many years did you have to wait for that third of the pound?
That's what we're going to talk about. So
Okay, we won't rush. We'll let you talk. Okay.
I'll get to the caviar part as well. So there is variation with our species. So in the wilds, the sturgeon are bottom feeders where they feed along the bottom of riverbeds. So they're consuming things like zooplankton, small crustaceans, and fish. So it takes a really long time for them to grow large and to mature. So in the wild, we're seeing maturity, and I'm classifying maturity and caviar a little bit different. So I'll try and lay those down for you, what those differences are. So maturity is when we're able to collect eggs and sperm to spawn the fish. So when they're able to be spawning is when they're mature. Caviar is a little bit different because we're able to harvest them before they are actually mature. When they start developing eggs, we are able to harvest them. So it takes 10 to 12 years in the wild, and we've seen some of ours mature around 6 years. Because we're feeding them a high protein diet, we're able to see them develop fat faster, and we're able to get them to a larger size more quickly. So I'm making sure I'm staying on track with what I'm saying. So you guys talked a little bit about spawning the catfish, how you collect the eggs. It's a little different when it comes to sturgeon, and it's definitely harder than, it's hard when you're making hybrid catfish. For sturgeon, you have to artificially spawn them, induce spawning using hormones. So without getting too technical, we'll show you a video of our hatchery, which is where we deal with all of our spawning techniques. So basically, once we see those sturgeon mature, we're gonna go ahead and bring them into our hatchery. So when they're around 6 to 10 years old, it just depends on when we're seeing them mature. We have to take samples to see their eggs and sperm. So we're gonna bring them into our hatchery, and in the middle of our hatchery, you'll see these stainless steel tanks. So we wanna manipulate the temperatures in our system so we can try and simulate spawning to some extent before we add hormones to the fish. So in these tanks, we're able to drop the temperature down. So we're gonna put some sturgeon in there, males and females, and you typically need more males than one female. So what we're gonna do is once they're ready, we're going to extract the eggs from one female, and we're gonna extract sperm from multiple males, and we're gonna go ahead and combine them together by hand. And we need a lot of people to do that because females have thousands of eggs, not thousands of dollars eggs, that's true too. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix it by hand, and one female can have anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 grams of eggs. So that's a lot of eggs to deal with. So these are our hatching trays that you guys saw, those blue trays. What we're gonna do is we put them in McDonald's jars, which were the jars at the front of the tanks. So once we fertilize the eggs, we're gonna drop them inside the McDonald's jars, and they're going to have a constant flow of water and oxygen so that they're staying, so that we're making sure that after they're fertilized that they're staying healthy. And then after a week or so, dependent on the temperature, we'll see them start to hatch. So what they're gonna do is they're gonna hatch in the jars and swim out into those blue trays that you see in the back of the hatchery that we have, where they'll spend some time growing. We spend most of our time in the hatchery here with our fish so that we're able to feed them a commercial diet and that they're able to grow quickly. We start off by feeding them brine shrimp, which is also known as artemia. So these cone-shaped jars that you guys see on your left-hand side right here, we raise the brine shrimp here in our hatchery. And then what we're gonna do once they hatch, we're gonna put them in the tanks and feed them to the fish after they consume their yolk sacs, which you guys talked about with the catfish. So those are the McDonald's jars that you can see now, and the fish will swim up to the top of those and swim out to the trays. So it's a really cool experience. Sorry I didn't have any videos that were high enough quality to show you the hatching process and seeing in the trays. I mean, you'll see thousands of babies in those trays after. That stretcher that I'm showing in the video right now, that's where we have to place the sturgeon because these sturgeon are 100 pounds. We have some that could be 60 pounds, but some of the larger ones in this tank that you can see right here, some of those weigh 60 to 100 pounds that we have inside that tank. So it's very difficult to work with these fish. You have to be really careful. I've been whacked in the face before. So once you put them in the stretcher, you have to make sure to close it really quickly or else a tail will come up and it can whack you in the face. So you have to be really careful about that. So once the sturgeon are in those blue hatching trays, we give them a few weeks, but they'll start to overcrowd very quickly once they start getting fed the commercial diet. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna move them into those concrete tanks, which have automatic feeders. Then once they, after about a month or so, dependent on how quickly they're growing, we're gonna move them outside to our grow out tanks where we've been raising them. So does anyone have questions about the spawning process or anything dealing with the hatchery?
Could you sell your beluga caviar in another country? Like
You cannot.
you can't.
So we're not allowed to sell it outside of the state of Florida. And my family knows more of the technical things when it comes to all the regulations and rules on that. But from what I know right now is we have been working to sell them, you know, outside of the state of Florida. So right now, and beluga is the most highly desired, and so that's why they were overfished for their caviar, and we're having those problems now because they were overfished. So right now we cannot.
Okay, any more questions actually about the hatchery and about producing the babies before we start growing them out? So that was the question, how fast do they grow?
So let's try and put this into perspective. So I was telling you guys years that it takes for them to reach maturity, and it's going to be dependent on the species. So it takes years for them to become as large as you see in some of those videos. So those are 7-year-old belugas that I showed you guys in the second video. So it took them 7 years to reach 100 pounds. But some of our other species are a lot smaller than beluga. So it can take them 4 to 6 years to start seeing maturity, more to the end of 6 years though. So it doesn't take like months or, you know, years like catfish, tilapia, and other fish species that we're used to. I mean, that's why they're so highly prized, is because the time that it takes to get to caviar, the time that it takes to raise them and feed them a very high protein diet. So something that makes them a little more expensive too is they are fed like a 45% or 35% protein diet. And also we have to feed them sinking pellets because they are bottom feeders, and so they need to sink to the bottom to feed. So this is going more to the grow out phase of things. So once they move outside of the hatchery, we're going to move them into our circular tanks, which help them simulate the environment that they're swimming in. They can constantly swim around and around. They're almost like sharks. They really don't stop swimming. They just continually swim round and round in circles. We have to maintain oxygen, typically above 5 if you want your fish to be healthy and happy. And then we've been feeding them a 35 to 45% protein diet, depending on where they're at in their development.
So
And
another
then-
hatchery question before you move on, Lauren.
Of course.
So Sam wanted to know, so how many times can you bring in a fish and have them spawn? I mean,
Multiple times actually. So we've been able to spawn, we typically do a few spawnings like throughout the year, depending if we're lucky. I mean, this is a very hard process to do. And when it comes to sexing them, so that's a hard topic because sturgeon are not sexually dimorphic. So we can't tell, okay, that's not a female, you know, we don't know what's a female or a male. So we have to take biopsies in order to tell if they are female or a male. So I almost even forgot the question, but we are able to spawn a fish multiple times. We do not have to harvest the females or males to extract it. It is pretty hard on the females because we have to make an incision to remove the eggs from her. But we've had some females die in the process just because it is very strenuous on herself. And then also she's out of the water for a certain period of time. But we've had most of our females live, and they could probably spawn again if they're ready to. So you can do it multiple times. Any other questions?
That's the only one I have.
thank you.
Okay, and so we typically save a certain type of fish for our brood stock. And then we also have our caviar fish, which are a little bit different. And so For our caviar fish, we can, like I said earlier, the caviar and the spawning are a little bit different for sturgeon. So we are actually able to take the sturgeon earlier when they're about 4 to 6 years old, and we have to harvest the full female in order to get all of her eggs. But like I said, we can get 1,000 to 3,000 eggs from one female. And so from that process, when we harvest the female for caviar, we save the full body for selling for meat. And that's been a hard part for us on our end for marketing, is selling sturgeon meat. We haven't had a hard time with caviar. I mean, we're selling it all around the world, not all around the world, mostly within the United States, but we're selling it to New York, to New Orleans. Actually, Chef Emerald in New Orleans has been a pretty frequent buyer for us. But when it comes to the sturgeon meat, have you guys ever had sturgeon meat before?
I heard it's really good though.
Has anybody?
No, in fact, we have a son here of a chef from a very nice restaurant here in Cedar Key, but they said no.
No
that's not.
sturgeon. So that's something that we've had a hard time dealing with. A really good way to prepare it is to smoke it. So we don't have the facility right now to do that on our own, to smoke it, to package it and sell it. We'll be working on that. My grandma has a really good smoked fish dip. If you guys have like a smoked mullet dip before, I mean, this is out of this world. It's really good. So we're going to try and sell it from that standpoint. But right now we've had a hard time marketing and selling our sturgeon meat. So we're hoping to improve on that aspect. So does anyone have any questions about sturgeon overall before I move on to tilapia?
No, that's interesting. I didn't know.
They're still fixated on the sturgeon dip. Sorry, these are
I know.
these are mullet dip aficionados, so they're still thinking about the sturgeon dip.
It's really good. It has garlic, chive, green onions, and sour cream. It's delicious. Not sour cream, cream cheese. So my grandma has that recipe down. You know, it's just one of those things that she's mastered. So we're going to try and produce that and sell that once we get there.
So I have a question. What is the typical yield then of meat from one of these big sturgeons that you have to harvest for the roe?
So that's something that's really interesting, because sturgeon have it's hard to describe their body. So we're kind of seeing something similar to more like a swordfish, like steaks. So their meat is not necessarily like as flaky, and it's surrounded by a lot of fat. So typically we do bullets. So we're taking off the head and the tail, and we're almost taking off like 20 pounds of some fish. So say we have like a 60-pound fish, we can remove like 20 pounds. So it's really decreasing the yield that we get. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take the bullet size of the sturgeon and then cut those down into like small slabs. And so when we're getting really down to it, the dress out value, I haven't really calculated it, but I'm pretty sure it wouldn't be that great. Just because you're dealing with a lot of scoots, you're dealing with a lot of head weight, and then it's not like a really bony fish like you see with tilapia and catfish. You're not having a great dress out value, but you're still eating all of the fat in the fillet together. So I'll have to test that and see what the dress out value is and let you guys know. Any more questions?
No, they're ready to taste sturgeon dip, but I didn't hear any questions unless you're going to provide some.
Okay, and then this video I'm showing you guys next is our tilapia that we have on our farm. And so these are Nile tilapia. They're actually in a polyculture right here. This is the best video I could get because most of our tilapia are in ponds. So if you look in the background, you can actually see some of our citrus sturgeon. And there's one going by in the back now. There's one right there. And so with our Nile tilapia, we started with pond culture. And so if any of you guys are familiar with tilapia, when it comes to spawning, it is significantly easier than sturgeon because you put them in the pond and they do it all on their own. You put them in tanks and they'll do it all on their own. I mean, they are just phenomenal when it comes to reproducing and making a larger population. So for spawning in our ponds, the tilapia will create circular nests when they're ready to spawn, and the females will lay eggs in the nest, and the males will come over and fertilize them. So I don't know if you guys have heard of the word mouth brooding. So tilapia are mouth brooders. So our male tilapia will then scoop up the tilapia eggs and put them in their mouth where they will incubate until they're ready to hatch. And so it sounds pretty gross, but at the same time, it's it's pretty smart because they're able to guard their eggs until they hatch. And then they'll even stay in the mouth when they're the fry size as well. So when they're ready to go out on their own, they'll start to consume things in the pond like plankton and aquatic plants. So we actually supplement some of our tilapia with feed. And then we've been doing some tank culture as well. So that really helps us to cut the market size, the time to reach market size in half. So it takes them maybe around 1 year to 2 years if you were to just leave them out in the ponds. But we can cut that down in half if we put them in tanks and we're feeding them a diet consistently twice a day. So that's what we've been relying more on recently, because we've had people wanting to buy fish live. So they'll come to our property and they'll come with their tanks and whatnot. And it's a lot of Asian markets that have been coming to buy our tilapia, and actually more recently hybrid striped bass. So we will have them in the tanks readily available, and the people will come and pick them up from the tanks once they're market size. And market size is usually around 1 to 1.5 pounds. It depends on what they're looking for, if they're cleaning them themselves, or if, so a lot of people put them in aquariums and people pick what they want to eat. So that's been a consistent buyer of ours to get the tilapia. The problem with tilapia, like we've been talking, like you guys were talking about with the PowerPoint, is we're seeing significant competition, and that's driven the market price for tilapia down. And it's hard for us on our end because we're putting all of our feed and our effort into catching the fish, to feeding the fish. And when we have to bring our market price down, it's really hard on us as a farm. And that's because we're seeing competition from South America, from other places that have very cheap labor. So we're going to hope to turn that around. I'm not sure, it's difficult to do, but we've had a hard time with our tilapia as well, trying to not go down on our market price. But we have been selling them consistently as well. Does anyone have questions about tilapia?
Okay, so the question was, do you raise multiple species of tilapia like you do with your sturgeon?
We only raise one species of tilapia, the Nile tilapia. And from a marketing standpoint with the sturgeon, the reason we have different species is because there's actually a lot of differences within the caviar, and then also within the taste of the caviar itself. So we're able to use that as a selling point for our sturgeon species. So we actually seasonally we sell a sampler, which gives a sample of 3 species of caviar: our Siberian, our Sevruga, and our Cetra. So that's been a really hot, thing that people want during the holidays, is to sample 3 different species of caviar.
When we were talking earlier in the PowerPoint presentation, I think there were some comments about tilapia, how the guys here said they didn't like it because it was off flavor.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was a concern, that it was off flavor. So you want to address that?
So off flavor, and you guys can think of catfish a lot too. I mean, to me, it tastes pretty earthy and muddy sometimes. And a lot of that has to do with the environment that the fish are raised in. So in my opinion, the tilapia that we raise in our ponds and our tanks are superior to other things that you guys will order at a restaurant, that you'll buy at the supermarket, because a lot of those are imports, and they're not controlling the way that the water that they're raising those fish in. So a lot of those factors go into the taste of the fillet. Bacteria within the system, the plankton within the system, it all affects the flavor and the off flavor of the fillets. So from our systems, we're recirculating our water, and we're also putting our water through sand filters. So it's going through a large filtration system as well before it's resupplied back to our tanks. So like I was showing you in those videos, our water is really clean, and that definitely boils down to having a better flavored fillet when it comes to the tilapia itself. So yes, there are some off flavor things, and that's probably because we're dealing with a lot of imports.
Exactly. So I know a higher value market for your tilapia is the live fish market. So
Yeah.
what are you supplying a lot to the live fish markets?
And that's been, we've actually been selling more hybrid striped bass on our farm recently than we have tilapia. But what they will do is, how we will collect them, we'll go ahead and cast net or seine our ponds to collect the tilapia from the ponds. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put them in our tanks. So the buyers can come with their tanks, drive up, and we'll go ahead and net them into their tanks, and they'll drive down to Orlando and they'll sell the fish at their restaurants and aquariums and things like that. So that has been a very frequent thing that we've been dealing with recently, is live fish buyers. And on our end, that makes it pretty difficult, just because you really have to be cautious with how you're capturing them. If you're feeding them, you have to be really detailed when it comes to making sure that these fish are healthy and alive, because they rely on selling them from a physical standpoint to other people. Okay, look at this fish in my tank, like, and it's really pretty. So we need to make sure that we're giving our best product to these people if they're going to be selling them in live systems.
So, yeah, so let's talk a little bit more about processing, and you may have touched on this a little bit, but let's go back to your caviar per se. So
Yes.
what's the processing steps you have to take from your farm?
So for caviar, what we typically do is we're going to go outside to our circular tanks that were in the video, that were in the first video. So we have our grow out sturgeon there, our mature sturgeon. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to look at females to see, okay, can we see if their bellies are actually round? It's hard to describe without showing pictures, but we try and do physical exams of our sturgeon. So our females that we think are slap full of eggs, they can actually show that by having a more round belly than the other sturgeon. So we're going to go in and do physical exams, and we're going to feel them to see what it feels like. We've kind of established like a system to looking and feeling our sturgeon, which sounds pretty weird, but it makes sense on our end, before we go ahead and sample the females for our sturgeon, because we do not want to do that unless we're sure that we may have a caviar. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a small incision if we think that the females have sturgeon, which is, you know, less than an inch if we can do it. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a stainless steel instrument that has an engraved center. And what we can do is we can slip that through the incision, and we can take a sample of the ovary or testes. Well, in this case, we're looking for eggs, so in the ovaries, and we're going to pull that out and see if we have any eggs. And so what will happen is in that engraved part of the stainless steel tool, we'll actually see all the eggs and see if it's adequate enough for us to harvest. So what we're going to do from there is we're going to bring it into our hatchery, and we're going to bring her body temperature down, cooler, just because when we handle her, we want everything to be perfect. But also, when it comes to slowing down her body temperature, we're not going to feed her, and that'll start slowing down her metabolism, and she's not going to eat anything at this point too. So after about 2 weeks of cooling down her body, we're going to put her in an ice bath. And so that's also going to, and so I'm trying to, you know, say this in the most humane possible way, without any PETA people coming after me. And what we're going to do is we're going to put her in the ice bath, and we're going to give her a blow to the head to euthanize her at that point before we harvest her for caviar. So then what we're going to do is we're going to bleed her out at this point, and we're going to cut her open and take the eggs. So when it comes to caviar in this processing, the eggs are attached to two sides of ovaries on the sturgeon, and they are typically attached to fat. And the best comparison is like a pomegranate, like the eggs are molded into the fat. So what they're going to do is they're going to take out both sides of the ovaries, and we're talking about, I just harvested a female recently, and we had 3 kilograms of eggs. So that was a lot of eggs coming from one female that only weighed 40 pounds. So sometimes we're seeing that the eggs weigh 20% of her body weight. So it's really cool if we're able to get a lot of yield from one female. Then what we do is we're going to take the eggs and put them on a mesh screen, and then we're going to separate the eggs from the fat. We're going to rinse the eggs, and then we're going to salt the eggs after we rinse and dry them. And then we're going to can them up and put them in a cold storage until we're ready to sell the eggs to buyers. And so we've had some buyers that buy it in bulk, like 1 kilogram, 2 kilograms, but most of our buyers, we vacuum pack some caviar, and we send them anywhere from 10 grams to 1,000 grams. We're able to vacuum pack. So we have 10 grams, 30 grams, 50 grams. 10 grams is something that you could share with 1 to 2 people, and then we kind of sell it on that aspect of how many people are you trying to serve for your caviar. So that's how the caviar processing works. And it's usually like a long effort that could take up to 2 hours, just because we're dealing with so many eggs, and we need to make sure that they're clean and separated from the fat. So it's taking a long time, but we have a lot of hands on decks, usually a lot of family members like me, my mom, and my grandma. and some other people working on it when we harvest caviar. So that is how we do that.
That's pretty cool. So we did have one comment. So
Uh-huh.
why can't you use ultrasound to detect the presence of eggs?
So that has been a heavily researched area, is to try and sex sturgeon without making any incisions. So ultrasound has been a way to look at it, but we have noticed the problem that we have in Florida is when we're outside, is looking at the ultrasound machine can be really difficult when we are outside in the sun. And even though we have a shade cloth, it's really hard to look at the ultrasound machine and read it correctly on our sturgeon. But we have been able to see that that has been proven to be useful. So you go ahead and we'll like make a shade cloth over our heads when we're reading the ultrasound machine and use that to look at if we have eggs in our female or not. But it still doesn't give you the full picture of what the eggs are looking like exactly. Like sometimes, so we judge it also by like the firmness of eggs. So when eggs are to the point where they're almost like reabsorbing, so this means they're towards the end of having the eggs, they're going to reabsorb them in their body. We'll start to see that they start to get like not as firm anymore, and they'll start to pop very easily. So we need to see those factors when it comes down to harvesting our caviar as well. So making the incision has been a frequent way for us to do it quickly and accurately. But our sturgeon are very precious to us because they're quite expensive. So we healing correctly. So we keep an eye on those females that we make incisions from and make sure that they heal up quickly and well. And don't get any infections from those incisions as well.
Okay, so the comment was, that's cool. So I guess that's a good comment.
Yeah. But ultrasound is a common way to do it, and also endoscopy as well. So putting a camera, but you still have to make an incision for that, but making an incision and putting a camera in there without using the instrument to take a sample. That's been another way. And a heavily researched field, especially for sturgeon, is being able to sex them without making any incisions, taking blood, trying to do different ways like that to see if it's a male or female.
How expensive is a surgeon? You mean what? Well, they're breeding them. They're breeding them. So I don't know. So you're asking what are the costs involved? Well, I don't know. That's going to be a.
So when it comes down to our feed, we have a pretty large operation for our sturgeon. So I'll just give you a rough estimate. We're talking about $8,000 for all of our feed for one period of time to feed all of our sturgeon for a few months. So that is a pretty high cost because we're dealing with a very high protein feed. Also a big cost to us is electricity. So like I said, water and oxygen are the two most important things when it comes to a fish farm. So for us to be able to recirculate our water and also to keep our oxygen running and everything like that, I mean, we have a hefty like electricity bill as well. So we need to make sure that we are, keeping our costs and finding the best feed that's available, and that we don't have to transport it from very far away as well, because that's something that we've dealt with those as well. Because we are getting a sinking trout food, and at times we had to get those over from like Utah, like Salt Lake City, like on the other side of the United States. So it costs some money to us to get it over here as well. But now we've been working with Cargo, which is located in Mississippi. So we've been having to bring down those costs to get our feed here as well. But it is pretty expensive to keep things running, to keep things going, to feed your fish and to keep them happy. So hopefully the caviar can help pay the bills. That's the thing.
All right. We have another question.
Yes.
So fella that moved to Cedar Key from Arkansas, very familiar with catfish production. Do you use paddle wheels to aerate the ponds?
Yes. So since I was mentioning that we started our hybrid striped bass production actually from Arkansas, we had to aerate our ponds. And so we used the paddle wheels to help aerate. Like we have 2 to 3 in each pond of our acre ponds. But for our tilapia ponds, we actually don't have any aeration. We have a pretty steady oxygen, and we take oxygens every day. So we want to make sure that our fish are not in anything that's less than 5 when it comes to dissolved oxygen. So our tilapia are able to thrive in ponds without any oxygen source. But our tanks have air stones, and then we actually have some air diffusers as well inside of our larger tanks as well. But when it comes to tilapia, the only thing that can really harm them is cold temperatures, which we've actually seen in Florida, surprisingly, cold enough to kill some of our tilapia over the winter. So that is how we deal with our oxygen for those ponds and tanks.
So you described your farm as a family-run farm, but
Yes.
that's a lot of production going on. So how many people really are involved in running your farm?
So my grandma is the one who owns and operates it mainly. So she's the one that will deal with all the business side of things, but my uncles also come and help as well. My uncle owns a recycling plant, so he will help supply equipment, and then he also helps supply like any, so actually some of our tanks are concrete, and that was recycled concrete from his plant that we were able to use for our tanks. So I am the third generation, so I came around to help as well because I love fish. I love fish farming, and obviously like I got a nice dose of catfish, and I think I was kind of sick of catfish, so once I graduated from Auburn, I came back here to help. And then so yeah, and then my mom also is very big on the fish farming aspect as well, so she'll come every weekend to help after her day job during the week. So yes, we are family owned and operated from the family. That's the family side, but we also have a fish technician. So what she does is she'll take all of the oxygens daily. She will make sure that there's no morts in our tanks, because nothing's better than pulling out like an 80-pound dead sturgeon. That's pretty rough. And then she will also feed the sturgeon daily as well. Then we also have two guys that work on our farm as well, and they help with the seining, with the cast netting, making sure that we have some market fish readily available. And also we have one guy helping on our spawning techniques as well. So we need help organizing all of our records for our females, our males, and making sure if we're ready to spawn a fish that we can do so and know what we're doing when we do it. So it takes a few helping hands to keep this operation running and to keep all the fish healthy and happy. So, and it's pretty hard out there in that Florida heat. I mean, you know, we reach really high temperatures, and you know, whenever I get hot, I just go for a dip in the sturgeon pond. You know, it's fine.
It's really hot.
Any more questions? All right, we have an off-topic question. Maybe,
Okay, go ahead.
Let's hear it. Oh my goodness, these guys are nothing but fishermen here. He wants to know how big your cast nets are.
Okay, you know what? I really don't know. I try to think. Okay, what's a really common one? It's not that big. We don't have a big cast net because we don't need to really catch that many fish and handle them. We want to be as careful as possible. So, what's something that's common, like 8 foot? I don't know.
All right. Any other more pertinent questions, Trey? Well, if not, I want to thank you so much for sharing your farm with us. It's been very interesting. And so now, is this going to be your new career now that you're graduated from Auburn, or are you looking for another job? What are you going to do?
Yes. So I graduated in May from Auburn, and actually I studied largemouth bass genetics. So I kind of like did a research assistantship. So I did what I was paid to do, and I actually really enjoyed it a lot. So I will possibly be moving to California at the end of this year, and I've linked up with a private aquaculture company that does genetics on fish. So I'm hoping to possibly see if I can get a job there if there's an opening, because I'll be out there in California. So, but I hold this farm very close to my heart, and if you guys are ever looking for some work to do, or if you guys are ever looking to visit and you're in Pearson, Florida, we would love for you guys to stop by and see our facilities, because nothing compares to like seeing all this in person. It's really cool to see those, you know, those big beluga like close up encounter. So yeah, I will, this will not be my career, unfortunately, but I'm hoping to come back to Florida to retire, you know, when I'm done with my career, hopefully.
Well, wish you the best of luck, and you just never know what might bring you back to Florida.
Exactly.
So thank you again for sharing us those great pictures. And, you know, Pearson's not too far from Cedar Key, actually.
Yeah.
It would be cool to visit. All right.
Yeah.
or a job. Now they're thinking a job. We've got folks in here that work with their parents and family on clam farming. Obviously, this is Cedar Key, so
Yeah.
maybe they'll diversify. All right. Any other questions? That's it. All right. Again, thank you, Lauren. Good luck.
Of course, guys. Thank you.